we know that certain herbs and drugs have toxic compounds and have toxic capacities. So some in the formulas that are made in Chinese medicine, one class of herb is called the Envoy herb. So in Chinese medicine, in most botanical medicines, we're rarely using one herb at a time. We usually like to do combinations because of the potential for synergistic effects. And if you think of what an envoy is, when you come from visiting from another country, you meet the envoy, and the envoy takes you to meet the emperor or the president or whomever. And it's so easy for us to make social faux pas, like, not taking our shoes off when we go into the house, those kinds of things. So the envoy is there to prevent the rudeness of the guest as part of that. And so in botanical formulas, licorice is a real great envoy herb because it can reduce some of the toxicity of the other compounds. And this is, I think, something that is hardly ever talked about in the conventional cannabis world, is that we talk about tobacco as enhancing a head high, but we can be using other botanicals to potentially mitigate some of the toxic effects. Anyways, just another thought that popped into my head.
Hey, here's a question for
Other,
you.
go ahead.
So just this week, actually, somebody was talking to me about how they eat a ton of licorice. This is just funny you mentioned licorice specifically, but they were
Mm-hmm.
talking about how they eat a ton of licorice and they were on some medicine for, I want to say blood pressure maybe, and then weren't feeling great and looked up online and found out that the licorice was actually a terrible thing to be eating, and especially so much of while they were taking
Oh
some certain
yeah.
drugs.
Oh
I
yeah.
had no
Yeah,
idea
yeah.
that was such a
Yeah.
serious
Great,
interaction.
great question. So let's talk about that. And we use this in the concept of synergy. Great question. So licorice, part of what licorice is an adaptogen. Part of its role is as an adaptogen. And what an adaptogen does is it helps us adapt to stress. And there is a chemical in licorice called glycyrrhizin that does not land. One of the chemicals that our adrenal glands pump out is called cortisol. Okay. And the glycyrrhizin does not land on the receptors that the cortisol is using, but it extends the half life of cortisol. So when we eat licorice, our body's stress molecules last longer. And as a result, we have more of a robust response to stress without having to actually have our body make any more of the chemicals. One of the downsides of licorice is that by extending this half life of cortisol, it can cause increased blood pressure. So, this is why naturopaths excel at this, naturopathic doctors, as opposed to medical doctors who just do what you do and get online. No, you do not use licorice in a hypertensive patient. Good point. However, licorice is also really good for soothing the digestive tract. So if we have herbs that may possibly cause an upset stomach, but they have some, because of negative side effects, right? But they have some other positives, and we want to try and maybe sneak these through to get some help. You can get a deglycerated licorice that does not cause elevated blood pressure, but that can soothe the digestive tract. So, but it doesn't give you the cortisol extending properties, but you can still, the licorice can then be an envoy and say, we're going to get you through, we want to get this herb through the digestive tract and into where it is needed. Fantastic and excellent question. And
That's fascinating, and again, it's just funny you mentioned that because I was just having this conversation yesterday, and I thought, wow. So, what is your thoughts on the idea that potentially some of these in isolation, maybe harmful things, are acting as maybe an envoy or doing some minor forms of stress that might actually be helping us in some ways, right? Because if we never got stressed out, our bodies in any way, then we would be very weak. So I'm just
yeah,
wondering
yeah.
your thoughts on it.
Great question. There was an ancient Greek physician, I believe it was Galen, was his name, and he said, "All things can be poisonous, but it is or they can be helpful, but it is the dose that makes them so."
Okay.
So there's a certain type of a rat poison that we use to kill rats. And in humans, if we eat that rat poison, it could kill us too. But at the proper concentration, that rat poison is Coumadin, which is a blood thinner, which is a lifesaver. So within you can have a toxic chemical at a certain dose that it can be beneficial at another dose. Go ahead.
Now I'm having a thought about my question and about what you just said. So it's not about the compound or the molecule itself, it's about the dosage that matters the most, right? And as I'm hearing this, I'm thinking, well, if you've got you know, a huge mixture of different compounds, you're probably more likely to maybe not hurt yourself compared to if you're just eating something that's isolated, right? Like if you just
I think that in the context of plants, because and this is before heating, combustion, chemical derivation, etc. All of the molecules that the plant makes, they're making within a eukaryotic cell, a cell that is in many ways similar to our cells, so that the concentration or the toxicity of it in the living plant material is typically a lot less. And then if we take that, Andy, and we think about how are we making chemotherapy drugs effective and still dealing with their toxicity, the oncologists are doing the same thing. They will utilize a number of different chemicals to treat different biochemical pathways, and this one particular one might be very toxic, and but because there is a combinatorial effect, lower doses can be used, and it can be more efficacious or more stable on the system.
it's fascinating. I At the last time we had this conversation, I really felt like inspired, like uplifted, like I really like put pieces together when we were having our conversation. But we went from one random question to like three others that clicked with me. You know what I mean? I talk about all the time that I think that the mixtures and the magic is in the mixture. That's what we always say around here. And you know, we talk about how we do believe that these mixtures, full spectrum, full plant flower is in a lot of ways more beneficial for me personally, and it seems to be for a lot of people than just isolated compounds. And then we know that when we burn those isolated compounds, they turn into a variety of other different things. So I just can't stop thinking about the idea that you know, when you compare like pharmaceutical drugs to plant-based medicine, the obvious major differences are the isolated compound or even synthetically derived, but one thing versus a mixture of things. And my first thought was, oh, it's kind of like the throwing spaghetti at the wall and we'll see what sticks with the mixtures. But then I've learned over the years that it's a lot more than that. It's these combinations and how they are catalysts for other transformations and other reactions and modulating things. And it's much more complicated than I ever imagined. But it makes me feel better about my choices as well. Because full disclosure, right? I told you this before. My interest in all this is purely based on my health issues that I've had, which I've got a rare neurological disease that doesn't have treatment options, doesn't have drugs, and I'm very involved with a group called the Hereditary Neuropathy Foundation, where we're doing some research for finding potential pharmaceutical drugs for people in this population, and looking at orphan drugs to see what might work and that kind of thing. But that there are a variety of plants available to all these people today, right? I think there's almost 7,000 rare diseases, and there's only like 200 pharmaceutical drugs for those diseases. How many of these people, if they had the education or people like you to explain this stuff to them, might actually have some hope and say, wow, I can look to Mother Nature and maybe find something that at least gets me through the day or makes me feel better or whatever it is. So, you know, it's important to me to learn this stuff. I appreciate your time and explaining a lot of
Oh,
this.
my pleasure.